When war broke out, maintaining the freedom of the seas was vital for Britain's ability to feed her population, to support her armies on the continent, and thus to continue the war. We will remember the 6,000 British and Commonwealth sailors who died during the battle.
The royal world is reeling today after a bombshell DNA test sent Princess Anne's husband into uncontrollable tears. The moment Timothy Laurence opened the report, he reportedly whispered, "This can't be real," before breaking down completely. What the test confirmed was a secret Princess Diana hid for decades. A secret so explosive that insiders say it could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the monarchy. The story begins quietly, not with a dramatic public announcement or a sudden appearance at the gates of a royal residence, but with something far more ordinary.
It always has been one of the remarkable features that international competition for so long has been equal between men and women. It took a little bit longer with eventing, but not that much.
A set of documents being sorted through by a group responsible for archiving the belongings of a former royal staff member. The staff member, who had passed away some months prior, had served during the later years of Diana's life. Much of what was being packed away for preservation was typical material of the period: briefing notes, schedules, handwritten reminders, and a series of messages exchanged between private secretaries. However, among those papers was an item that immediately stood out. It was a single sealed envelope marked with a simple instruction in neat handwriting, to be opened only if the truth could not remain hidden any longer. The handwriting was recognized by those cataloguing the box. It matched examples of Diana's personal notes left in the staff archives from the same period. The team handling the documents followed procedure, logging the discovery and placing the envelope aside for a more senior archival review. There was no urgency attached to this step, as unexpected finds occasionally happen during the processing of older materials. Still, it was noted as unusual, given how rarely anything sealed by Diana herself surfaced outside collections already well documented. When the envelope was finally opened, the contents were limited but significant. Inside was a short note written in a calm but deliberate tone. It referred to a matter Diana believed might one day resurface in a way that required clarity. The writing mentioned a sample connected to a private medical check carried out near the end of her life. The note did not describe the nature of the test in detail, but it did make a reference that appeared to point towards someone close to Princess Anne. It did not accuse, nor did it reveal anything directly, but it suggested that if questions ever arose, the truth should be handled carefully and respectfully, without causing unnecessary distress or speculation. Because the wording touched on private family matters, the envelope and its contents were passed on to the appropriate office responsible for sensitive historical material. It was at that stage that a small group of advisors discussed how to interpret the note and what, if anything, should be done. The reference to a sample, paired with the mention of someone linked to Anne, raised enough ambiguity that further discretion was considered necessary. Decisions of this type typically require consulting those who might be directly affected, both for transparency and for fairness. This process resulted in a private message being delivered to Vice Admiral Sir Timothy Laurence, Princess Anne's husband. The message did not contain any accusations or conclusions. It simply informed him that a document had been found suggesting that his name might be relevant in a matter involving a historical sample connected in some way to Diana. The note included a suggestion that he meet with a designated senior staff member who could explain the situation in person. The message did not demand immediate action, nor did it hint at wrongdoing. Its tone was measured and procedural, respecting both privacy and protocol. Timothy Laurence, having long maintained a relatively quiet public presence compared to other members of the royal family, responded in the same steady manner he is generally known for. He agreed to meet privately, preferring to understand clearly what had been found before drawing any conclusions. Those who know him professionally often describe him as composed and deliberate, traits that likely guided his reaction at this early stage. During the meeting, the archival team presented the envelope and Diana's message exactly as they had found it. They explained the origin of the documents, how they were discovered, and why the wording had raised questions. Timothy reviewed the note quietly, taking time to read it more than once. The staff emphasized that the references remained open to interpretation and that no assumptions had been made. The purpose of sharing the information with him was simply to provide transparency and ensure that he, as the person most directly mentioned in the note, had the opportunity to address the situation according to his own judgment. The note mentioned a medical sample but did not identify whether it was biological, analytical, or symbolic in nature. It suggested that if circumstances warranted, clarification might be found through scientific verification. While the note did not specifically request that Timothy provide anything, it implied that his involvement might one day be necessary to bring closure to something Diana had considered unfinished. This message, thoughtful rather than urgent, was the basis for the meeting. Timothy listened carefully to the explanation. His first questions were straightforward. He wanted to know whether the matter had spread beyond the small group present, whether the information had been shared with the media, and whether any outside parties were aware that a reference to him existed in Diana's handwriting. He was told that the discovery had been handled with strict confidentiality and that only those required to process such documents were aware of its existence. Nothing had been leaked or circulated outside the appropriate channels. The next step, the advisors explained, would be entirely his decision. If he wished to clarify the reference, he could agree to cooperate with a private laboratory experienced in discrete genetic and medical analysis. This sort of testing is not uncommon in situations where historical or familial questions arise, and established protocols exist to manage such matters carefully. The advisors made it clear that he was under no obligation to proceed. The note did not impose one, nor did any legal or procedural rule. The choice was personal. He asked for time to reflect. This was granted without hesitation. Before leaving the meeting, he took the letter with him, intending to consider its implications in private. Those present observed that he was not visibly distressed or alarmed, but rather thoughtful, possibly weighing the potential consequences for himself, his family, and the legacy of Diana, who remains a figure discussed with both affection and scrutiny across Britain and abroad. Over the following days, Timothy maintained his normal schedule. He attended a previously arranged engagement with Princess Anne and continued his routine activities without any visible indication of inner turmoil. However, behind closed doors, he spent time rereading the note and considering what Diana's intentions might have been. While Diana did not elaborate on the nature of the truth she believed might resurface. The tone of her writing suggested she was aware that misunderstandings could grow if not addressed responsibly. This alone carried weight, given how often speculation surrounded her life and relationships. In the end, Timothy reached a decision guided less by speculation and more by a sense of responsibility. If there was even a small chance that the note's meaning could be clarified, he believed doing so might prevent future confusion or unwanted rumors. He contacted the advisors and informed them that he was willing to participate in a discreet test to determine whether his DNA had any relevance to the sample Diana referenced. This choice did not reflect panic or fear, but rather a desire to bring an end to uncertainty. Those involved made arrangements for a private appointment at a confidential facility equipped for such testing, ensuring that no information would be accessible to external parties. The appointment was scheduled quietly and without disruption to his public commitments, maintaining the privacy he valued. As the date approached, Timothy prepared himself for a process he had not expected to be part of his life. The situation remained private, known only to a small circle. There was no public statement, no speculation in newspapers, and no unusual movement within royal offices. Everything proceeded with the understated discretion characteristic of the individuals involved. The moment he arrived at the facility marked the beginning of a new and unexpected chapter, shaped not by assumptions, but by a simple desire for clarity. The events that followed, though personal and quiet, would lead to outcomes he could not yet predict. The process that followed Timothy Lawrence's decision to proceed with a private DNA test unfolded in a measured and carefully controlled manner. The small group overseeing the situation continued to prioritize discretion, both out of respect for the individuals involved and because the note from Diana made it clear that her intention had never been to create unnecessary disruption. The next steps required coordination between the archival advisors, the appointed laboratory, and Timothy himself, who quietly prepared for the appointment while maintaining his usual responsibilities. When the day of the test arrived, the arrangements were designed to ensure the least possible amount of attention. The facility selected for the analysis specialized in confidential medical and genetic services and had experience working with individuals who required privacy for personal or professional reasons. nothing about Timothy's arrival indicated anything unusual. He traveled without an entourage and entered the building through a private entrance arranged ahead of time. Inside the facility, the atmosphere was calm and clinical. He was greeted by a senior technician who had been briefed only on the essential details, that this was a sensitive historical matter involving a sample taken many years earlier, and that accuracy was important. The technician did not know the full context, nor did he ask. Such boundaries were standard practice in cases requiring confidentiality. Timothy was escorted to a consultation room where he was provided with a straightforward explanation of the procedure. The test itself would be uncomplicated, involving a routine collection of a biological sample. The technician explained how the results would be compared with the material referenced in the file associated with Diana's note. According to the facility, the original sample had been preserved under controlled conditions, which made analysis still feasible even after several decades. This was not unheard of. Archival samples, when stored properly, can remain viable for scientific inquiry long after their collection. He listened carefully to the explanation, asking a few practical questions about how the material was handled and how long the comparison process typically required. The technician's responses were factual and precise. The timeline for such analysis could vary, but in this case, because the nature of the historical sample required additional verification steps, it would take slightly longer than a standard result. Timothy accepted this information without comment. He signed the necessary paperwork, acknowledging his consent for the test, and then proceeded with the sample collection. The procedure was quick and uneventful. There was no immediate indication of what the results might show, as the technician maintained a neutral professionalism throughout. Once the sample was secured, it was sealed, labeled, and entered into the facility's tracking system with additional confidentiality measures. Only 2 individuals at the laboratory were authorized to access it, and both had undergone a briefing on the importance of discretion and accuracy. After leaving the building, Timothy returned to his day without outward signs of concern. People who saw him in the following days described him as composed, maintaining his routine of meetings and appointments. Few knew anything about the private matter he was navigating, and he gave no indication that anything out of the ordinary was taking place. This reserved approach was consistent with his long-standing preference to keep his personal affairs out of public scrutiny. While the analysis was underway, the advisors responsible for managing the archival discovery maintained regular contact with the laboratory. They did not pressure the technicians for early results, understanding that haste could compromise accuracy. Instead, they ensured that all necessary information from the archive documents had been provided and that the lab had everything required to proceed correctly. As the days passed, the significance of the decision he had made began to settle more heavily on Timothy's mind. Though he had approached the situation rationally, the possibility that the test might reveal an unexpected connection hovered at the edge of his thoughts. The note from Diana, while brief, had carried a tone that suggested concern rather than alarm, but its ambiguity left much open to interpretation. The uncertainty itself created a quiet strain, even if he did not express it outwardly. He found himself rereading the copy of the note he had taken with him after the initial meeting. Diana's handwriting was steady, neither rushed nor anxious, and the language she used was deliberate. It did not accuse or warn. Instead, it implied that she believed a truth existed that might eventually need to be addressed with clarity and fairness. This was perhaps the most compelling reason he had chosen to proceed with the test. Whatever the outcome, ignoring the note would not resolve the ambiguity it created. Meanwhile, at the laboratory, the analysis moved forward steadily. The first step involved verifying the integrity of the historical sample itself. Technicians examined its condition, confirmed its authenticity through documentation, and prepared it for comparison. Because the sample was connected to a period of Diana's life marked by intense public attention, every stage required double-checking to rule out any possibility of contamination or mislabeling. The facility maintained strict controls on archival materials, treating them with the same seriousness as forensic evidence. Following the verification stage, the comparative analysis began. This process involved a series of tests designed to identify whether the genetic markers present in Timothy's sample corresponded to those in the preserved material. These markers, once identified, would provide a clear answer to the question raised in Diana's note. The technicians proceeded methodically, aware that the implications of the results, whatever they might be, could be significant for those involved. They worked without speculation, focusing solely on accuracy. During this waiting period, Timothy maintained his decision not to discuss the matter with anyone except the advisors originally involved. Even Princess Anne, who remained unaware of the developing situation, noticed nothing unusual about his behavior. He believed that bringing her into the matter before the results were known would only introduce unnecessary worry. His intention was not secrecy, but caution. He wanted to avoid presenting her with uncertainties he could not yet explain. After several days, the laboratory reached the stage where preliminary findings could be assembled. These early results required internal verification before they could be shared. The technicians conducted repeat tests to confirm consistency, ensuring that any conclusion reached was grounded in data rather than assumptions. They followed established protocols, recording each step, cross-checking their work, and reviewing the documents associated with the historical sample once more to confirm alignment between the scientific findings and the archival context. When the internal checks were complete, the laboratory contacted the advisors and informed them that the analysis had produced a definitive result. Because of the sensitivity of the matter, they recommended that the findings be delivered in person, rather than through written or electronic communication. The advisors agreed and arranged a meeting, the same kind of private appointment used for the initial briefing. Timothy received the message notifying him that the results were ready. The tone was formal and neutral, giving no indication of the outcome. He had expected this type of communication and appreciated the professionalism. Still, receiving confirmation that an answer now existed created a quiet shift in his thoughts. The uncertainty would soon end, and whatever had been alluded to in Diana's note would finally be clarified. The meeting was scheduled for the following day at a private office rather than at the laboratory. This location provided a controlled environment where the findings could be explained without interruption. Timothy prepared himself in the same calm, practical way he had approached the initial test, though the knowledge that a conclusion awaited him carried a weight of its own. On the day of the meeting, he arrived on time, greeting the advisors with his usual courtesy. The atmosphere in the room was subdued, reflective of the seriousness of the matter rather than any anticipated reaction. A representative from the laboratory was present, carrying a sealed folder containing the final analysis. He took his seat, listened as the background of the process was reviewed, and waited for the representative to open the folder. The report inside, compiled with careful detail, contained the final, comparative result. The representative took a moment to confirm that Timothy was ready to hear the findings, then began to explain the conclusion reached through the analysis. This moment marked the point where uncertainty ended and clarity began, setting into motion consequences he had not fully anticipated when he first agreed to participate in the test. When the laboratory representative finished presenting the results, the room fell into a still silence. The explanation had been clear and methodical, without emotional emphasis. The conclusion, however, carried implications that none of those present could ignore. The genetic comparison had confirmed a connection between Timothy's DNA and the historical sample associated with Diana's note. The report did not assign meaning to the finding, nor did it attempt to interpret her intentions, but as far as the science was concerned, the match was genuine. Timothy took the report into his hands and read the summary twice, making sure he understood precisely what had been stated. There was no ambiguity in the language. The sample Diana had referenced was directly connected to him, though the context behind that connection remained unexplained. He asked a few straightforward questions about the reliability of the results, the potential margin of error, and whether any external verification would be necessary. The representative confirmed that the testing had followed strict protocols and that repeat analyses had yielded consistent outcomes. The advisors in the room, equally careful, acknowledged the significance of the result, but avoided making assumptions about the reasons behind Diana's message. After a few more clarifications, the meeting ended. Timothy left with the report sealed in an envelope, fully aware that the next steps would require careful consideration. The advisors provided space for him to decide how, when, and to whom the information should be disclosed. Their role was to support and protect the integrity of the process, not to dictate the outcome. They reminded him that the matter remained entirely confidential and that no one outside the small group involved knew the nature of the findings. On the drive home, Timothy remained quiet, keeping his attention on the road while his thoughts shifted through the implications of what he had learned. He had prepared himself for the possibility that the results might reveal something unexpected. But preparing intellectually was not the same as experiencing the moment in reality. What he now held was a scientific confirmation linking him to a decision Diana had made decades earlier, one presumably guided by reasons he could not yet fully understand. The connection did not imply wrongdoing on anyone's part, but it did raise questions about history, privacy, and the responsibilities of those who remain when others are no longer able to explain themselves. When he returned to the residence he shared with Princess Anne, he continued his reserved approach. Anne was in the middle of reviewing documents for an upcoming engagement and looked up briefly when he entered the room. There was nothing in his expression that signaled distress, and she continued with her work. He did not interrupt or begin the conversation at that moment. Instead, he set the envelope aside and decided to take time to consider how to present the information in a way that was clear, measured, and fair to everyone involved. The following morning, he requested a private moment with her. Anne, accustomed to the straightforward communication that had always defined their relationship, set aside her schedule to listen. He began by explaining the discovery of the note, the context in which it had been passed to him, and the reasoning behind his decision to participate in the test. He described the process as factually as possible, avoiding speculation and focusing on the practical steps taken by the archival team and the laboratory. Anne listened without interruption. Her expression remained steady, though her eyes narrowed slightly as she considered each detail. She asked to read the note Diana had written, and Timothy handed it to her. She spent a long moment examining the handwriting, tracing the meaning of each sentence. The ambiguity of the wording gave her pause, though she recognized that the tone reflected Diana's familiar mixture of caution and care when handling sensitive matters. When Timothy eventually explained the results of the test, Anne remained composed, though a noticeable tension settled in her posture. She asked him to clarify what the laboratory had confirmed and what it had not. He responded carefully, emphasizing that the report established a genetic link between himself and the preserved sample, but did not interpret why Diana had made reference to it or what she intended for the information to achieve. Anne then asked whether anyone else knew the outcome. He assured her that only the advisors and the laboratory representative were aware. What followed was a long, quiet pause. Anne set the report down and folded her hands. She was not emotional in the demonstrative sense, but the weight of the knowledge was evident. Her primary concern, she said, was understanding what the implications were for the people involved and whether Diana's decision to preserve the sample had been motivated by a desire to protect someone. Anne's focus was not on the potential public reaction, but rather on the personal responsibilities now placed upon them. Over the next several days, the two of them discussed the matter privately, drawing on their shared preference for measured decision-making. They agreed that speculation would only complicate the situation further, and that their priority should be to follow the intentions suggested in Diana's note, to handle the truth with care, sensitivity, and respect. The text had not asked them to publicize anything, nor had it advised concealment. It had merely implied that clarity might one day be required to avoid misunderstanding. They reached a decision that the next step should involve contacting the individual connected to the historical sample. Although the advisors had not initially proposed this action, they acknowledged that it was within Timothy's rights to do so. The difficulty lay in approaching the matter delicately, as the revelation carried personal ramifications that could not be predicted in advance. Arrangements were made, therefore, to reach the person privately. The individual, who had lived largely outside the public sphere, was informed that a matter concerning Diana's archived documents had surfaced and that a conversation was requested for the sake of accuracy and closure. The message made no mention of DNA or testing, only that information had come to light that might relate to them. Care was taken to ensure that they did not feel alarmed or pressured. When the meeting was scheduled, both Timothy and Anne agreed that it should take place in a setting that felt neutral and respectful. They chose a private office rather than a formal royal location. The intention was not to elevate the encounter into an event with political or public implications, but to keep it grounded in the personal nature of the discovery. In the days leading up to the meeting, Timothy reviewed the report again, ensuring he was prepared to answer questions as clearly as possible. He refrained from drawing conclusions beyond what the evidence showed. His intention was simply to present the facts and allow the individual involved to understand the circumstances directly. Anne, for her part, maintained her characteristic composure, though she remained aware that the meeting could prompt strong reactions. She believed that offering transparency was the most respectful approach, especially given the implications of Diana's note. The two of them agreed that their role was to provide clarity, not to intrude upon or reshape the person's life. As the scheduled day approached, the advisors continued to offer support, ensuring that no information leaked and that the meeting could take place without external attention. This level of discretion was essential, not merely for reputation, but because the matter involved deeply personal history for those affected. When the day finally arrived, Timothy and Anne travelled quietly to the meeting location, aware that what followed could reshape understanding that had remained unspoken for many years. They did not anticipate confrontation, but they recognized that honesty of this kind carries its own complexities. The individual they were about to meet would soon learn a truth rooted not in speculation or rumor, but in scientific confirmation, carefully obtained and responsibly delivered. When the meeting began, there was a sense of quiet anticipation rather than overt tension. The individual whom Timothy and Anne had agreed to meet arrived a few minutes early, having been informed only that a matter involving archived personal documents from the 1990s required clarification. They appeared calm but understandably curious, unsure of why such a request had been made after so many years. The advisors ensured that the setting remained private and comfortable, avoiding any impression of formality beyond what was necessary. Timothy greeted the individual with a steady, polite tone, thanking them for agreeing to come. He made it clear from the outset that nothing about the meeting was urgent, accusatory, or legally significant. The purpose, he explained, was simply to discuss information that had come to light through the review of archived materials and to ensure that those who might be affected by the content of those documents had the opportunity to hear the details directly and without speculation. The individual listened carefully, waiting for Timothy to continue. He began by describing the discovery of Diana's note, explaining when and how it had surfaced, and summarizing the instructions written inside. The individual's expression shifted subtly as they realized that Diana herself was connected to the matter. While they did not display alarm, the mention of her name introduced a level of seriousness they had not initially anticipated. Timothy moved slowly through the explanation, conscious of the fact that every detail would carry weight. He spoke about the reference to a sample, the ambiguity of the message, and the decision he had made to undergo a DNA test in order to clarify the matter responsibly. At this point, the individual leaned forward slightly, aware that the explanation was approaching its central point. Before presenting the result, Timothy paused to state something clearly. He said that the information he was about to share was not intended to alter anyone's life, identity, or understanding of themselves. It was presented only because Diana had indicated that clarity might one day be needed. Her note had never instructed anyone to take action beyond ensuring fairness and avoiding misunderstanding. He stressed that the results did not impose obligations, nor did they require any change in relationships or personal circumstances. He then opened the envelope containing the final analysis, placed it on the table, and summarized the findings in plain language. As he explained that the preserved sample held a genetic link to him, the individual sat back slightly, absorbing the information. Their reaction was measured. They did not appear overwhelmed, but rather quietly reflective. Several seconds passed before they asked a question, wanting to know what Diana had intended by leaving the note and whether she had explained her reasons to anyone. Anne responded with honesty. She stated that they could not know with certainty why Diana had chosen to preserve the sample or what specific outcome she had envisioned. The only guidance available came from the wording of the note, a request for careful handling and a hope that the truth, if ever needed, would be managed in a way that prevented confusion rather than creating it. Anne spoke gently, emphasizing that the purpose of the meeting was not to unsettle, but to provide transparency. The individual asked to see the note, and Timothy handed it to them. They read it silently, tracing the meaning with care. When they finished, they placed it back on the table and exhaled slowly, acknowledging that the information carried personal significance, but also recognizing that it did not rewrite the foundations of their life. They asked whether anyone else was aware of the findings. Timothy reassured them that confidentiality had been preserved strictly and that only those in the room and a small group of advisors had knowledge of the situation. Rather than reacting with disbelief or distress, the individual asked practical questions. They wanted to understand the process the laboratory had followed, the safeguards used in handling the archival sample, and whether any doubt existed regarding the accuracy of the results. Timothy answered each question factually, repeating what the technicians had explained to him. The advisors supported this explanation where needed, reiterating that no interpretation beyond the scientific data had been attempted. After a period of discussion, the individual thanked Timothy and Anne for informing them directly. They stated that the information, though unexpected, did not create confusion about their identity or sense of belonging. Instead, it provided context for a few aspects of their past that had always felt slightly unclear, though never troubling. They expressed appreciation for the care taken to present the facts respectfully and without pressure. The meeting concluded with an understanding shared among everyone present. The information would remain confidential unless the individual themselves chose to speak about it. There would be no announcement, no public statement, and no broad discussion within the family. The matter would remain personal, respected, and handled in the exact spirit Diana appeared to request. The advisors accompanied the individual out of the building, expressing gratitude for their calm and thoughtful engagement. Once the meeting ended, Timothy and Anne remained seated for several minutes, allowing the weight of the experience to settle. The encounter had not been dramatic or emotionally charged, but it carried a sense of finality. They had honored the intention of the note as best they could, provided clarity where ambiguity had lingered, and avoided imposing meaning where none had been specified. In the days that followed, Timothy felt a gradual sense of resolution. The process had not been easy, but it had been conducted with integrity. The truth did not reshape his life in a jarring way. Instead, it brought a clearer understanding of a decision Diana had made privately, one rooted in her concern for fairness and clarity. He found himself returning to her note, occasionally not out of confusion, but to reflect on the responsibility she had entrusted to those who would eventually discover it. Anne approached the matter similarly. She valued the quiet way in which the situation had been handled, and appreciated the level of respect everyone involved had maintained. She believed that responding to Diana's intentions with care was the correct decision, even if it required confronting an unexpected truth. She and Timothy continued their routines without noticeable disruption, carrying the knowledge privately, but with a sense of having done what was appropriate. The advisors who had facilitated the process maintained the confidentiality agreed upon. The report, the note, and the related documentation were placed in a secure archive accessible only with express permission. Nothing was recorded in a manner that would allow the information to circulate beyond its intended boundaries. The laboratory, having fulfilled its role, closed the file and removed identifying details from active storage, following standard protocols. Months passed without any outward sign that anything notable had occurred. Life within the royal orbit continued according to its usual rhythms. No rumors circulated, no misconceptions arose, and no unexpected questions were raised. The matter remained known only to the small circle who had approached it with discretion from the beginning. Occasionally, Timothy reflected on the experience, not with regret, but with a quiet recognition of its significance. He understood that the clarity achieved would remain discreet yet meaningful. The truth did not alter public narratives or private relationships in dramatic ways. Instead, it brought closure to a matter Diana had believed might one day need careful attention. By addressing it directly, he ensured that her final wish, however quietly expressed, had been respected. In the end, the situation became one of those private historical footnotes that exist quietly behind the public-facing events of well-known lives. It did not reshape the monarchy, rewrite any family line, or change anyone's place in the world. What it did instead was honor a message left by someone who, in her final years, remained deeply aware of the importance of clarity, truth, and compassion. For those involved, the resolution was not marked by dramatic revelation or public reaction. It was marked by understanding, by thoughtful communication, and by the willingness to approach an unexpected truth with maturity. And that, in many ways, fulfilled the essence of what Diana seemed to intend when she first wrote the note and sealed it away, trusting that one day the right people would know how to handle it.